Hello and welcome back, everyone, after the break. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our final keynote for this conference, Rachel Spicer, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Sciences at the LSE. She's the chief data scientist at one of the most successful databases in the humanities, the database of religious history. And as I already mentioned several times, it's been a database that is currently and still is very much an inspiration to us in HPS to think it shows a way in which it can be done. And in our particular group, we very much agree that if we are to succeed in this, we should also focus on questions and answers. And so it's a great pleasure to have Rachel here. So in her particular research, she utilizes the qualitative and quantitative database to investigate cultural evolution. So she co-authored a number of papers relevant to the theme of the conference. So we're very, very happy to have you, Rachel. So please take it from here.
Hi, everyone. And I just wanted to start with my background. So relevant to this conference, my background's in bioinformatics, and throughout my entire academic career, I've been working with databases. So when I was doing my PhD, I was working with this metabolomics database called Metabolite. So as well as the DRH, I have a lot of experience with like other databases as well. So when we get to the Q&A, if anyone's got any questions generally about having worked at multiple databases, I've got perspectives as to some of what works and what hasn't worked. So on to the DRH. So the DRH was founded back in 2012. So I must say that I only joined the project in 2018. So some of the initial development I was obviously not there for, but I've seen how it's developed since I joined. And today we have over 1,000 entries written by 500 experts and over 200,000 unique answers. So the DRH is effectively a quantitative and qualitative online encyclopedia, and it is organized around structured questionnaires, or as we call it, polls. So currently we have 3 polls in the database: the religious group poll, the religious place poll, and the religious text poll. Initially, there was only the religious group poll, but the place and text polls were then added to accommodate the needs of other types of scholars, because the database obviously has experts from a range of areas across religious studies, archaeology, and history. So if you go to the database and look at the structure of a poll, it looks something like this, where you have groups of questions, which then have subgroups, and then there are questions. We then also have parent questions and child questions, where, so the whole point is that each poll is structured hierarchically. And we have 3 types of expert entries. So I must say that the DRH is all expert driven. We require that someone has a sufficient academic background, usually at minimum a late stage PhD, to be able to contribute to the database. So around 96% of our entries are written by experts. The other ones are RA expert source. These entries are where an RA has filled in an entry based on an expert's previously published data. These draft filled in answers are then sent back to the expert, who then makes any comments and corrections, and then the entry is published. And there is also a couple of entries of supervised students in a classroom where a DRH editor has supervised students to create an entry. So additionally, we also collaborate with other projects. So we, for any religious data, we're happy to collaborate and take data from other databases. So we've got Hello to EHRAF and a mapping one. So we have, as well as to manage our huge number of experts, we have a team of editors. So we have 2 managing editors, Willis and William. And then we have a whole large team of more than 30 editors across 7 regions. We're always looking to recruit more editors because we know that we are lacking in certain areas. So the basic process of how we gather data for the database has been completely opportunistic. So initially, the database was very biased towards Chinese religions, because that is where Ted Singland, that's his area of research, and he is the main founder of the database. So we were massively biased towards that direction. But over time, we've actually started to get a more balanced, but still overrepresented in some areas, set of data, because now we're more well known, so easier to recruit than it was when the database started. So the process is editors will often go and proactively recruit experts who then create an entry. There is editorial oversight for the entry, and there'll be back and forth between the editor and the expert. And when the editor is sufficiently happy with the quality of the entry, the editor will approve the entry, which is then published. And additionally, the expert can then request a DOI for that entry, so it's fully citable. But the moment that is done by archiving at the UBC library, but we're looking to change this process, so we're minting our own DOIs instead. If you go to the browse entries page on the DRH, you'll see a list of entries. These symbols here indicate the type of entry that it is. So this is a place entry, this is a text entry. And if you click on one, this one is a group entry. This is the page you'll come to, or the top of it. So for every entry, there are a number of required features that the entry must include. These are religious group tags for religious groups and for all of the different poll types. For place entries, they must include place tags as well, and for text entries, they must include text tags as well. They must include a date range, and they must include the region that's covered, as well as region tags about what that region is. The tagging system is partly designed to be able to tell if 2 entries are for the same religious group, but partly is also for, especially for regions, it's for searchability as well. So the tagging system is a hierarchical series of tags where if a tag does not yet exist, an expert can suggest adding a new tag to this hierarchy. And additionally, for each entry, experts can add general references as well as references to specific answers. And they can add media files, again, to the entire entry or to specific answers. So this can be images, but it can also be text files, and we've got some videos as well. So whatever's the expert feels is required. So again, if you then scroll down the page of the entry, it will look very similar to the poll view page with the series of question categories again. And if you click on these, you will then see the answers where experts can add notes about the answer as well as direct references for the answer, but they do not necessarily have to, because the database is designed so it can be the primary source of publication about the research as opposed to necessarily requiring that there has been previous publication of it. So the majority of our questions are quantitative, with most questions being answerable with yes, no, field doesn't know, or I don't know. But there are some questions with other categorical variables, and there are some questions with qualitative answers such as yes, specify, or other specify, where the expert must give a qualitative answer if they answer that question. And yeah, as I mentioned before, we have this parent and child question system where the child question is only ever asked if the answer to the parent question is yes, because it requires that the parent question be yes for the child question to be relevant. This was designed this way to minimize overloading the amount of burden of answering the questions for experts, because for each poll there is a minimum of about 500 questions in total, so you don't want to ask questions which aren't relevant to the expert, because it's quite a lot of effort to fill out an entry already. So therefore we for analysis purposes we can always assume that the answer of no to a parent question also applies to the child question, as did field doesn't know and I don't know. So entries, we also allow for flexibility where entries can have multiple answers to the same question. So if there is disagreement between sources, an expert can answer both yes and no and cite the source of each answer. And also there are examples where experts want to highlight exceptions to a general answer. So for example, proselytization is required for missionaries in early China, but it isn't required for the Chinese adherents to, which have been converted. So as another layer of complexity of the database, for each question, we ask which group of people it applies to, and it can apply to all three of these, but they could have to select at least one of religious specialist, elites, and non-elite. This is especially relevant to things like celibacy, which often only apply to religious specialists. Additionally, this is in the wrong order, we allow experts to affirm, challenge, and comment on existing answers. So if there's an existing published answer which is disagreed with, another expert can come and answer the opposite of that, or they can affirm the answer and also answer yes. So for example, here is an affirmation of the answer, do natural beings mete out punishment? So here is the button. This is only available if you're logged into the database, and isn't available, you won't be able to view this if you're not logged in. So the goal of the database isn't to have a single answer for any one region and period. We want to gather as much data from as many different experts as possible, because we want to know what the consensus is, or if there's a disagreement about something, we want to document that. So ideally, for the same time period and region, we will have multiple answers with either agreeing or disagreeing. So the other main feature we have right now is the visualize tool, where you can search for a question. So for example, additionally, we allow searching by drawing a region on the map, as well as limiting by date range, type of poll, source, and source. So for example, is monumental religious architecture present? So I should say here that we have I'm allowing to include answers to related questions, but these are separated here. So you can see the is monumental religious architecture present, which is from the group poll, and is monumental architecture present is from the place poll. So you can see the distribution of answers, and you can see the distribution of answers globally. There's sometimes problems caused by entries that cross the date line. It doesn't always display correctly the regions. And then you can also see the distribution of those across time. But additionally, you can also view the entries as a table. So we have a primary scientific advisor is Joe Henrik, and we have a steering committee, including members of the database and external members, Russell Gray and Carol Amber, and additionally an advisory board. So this diagram kind of shows an overview as to the whole process of what's currently possible with the DRH. We are looking to expand what's offered by adding some new features later this year, like an analyze tool and better functionality for translation. So additionally, I just want to mention that there are some pedagogical lesson plans available, which are CC open access, CC license. They're open access. Anyone can use them to teach about how to use the DRH, but also designed to think about generalizations, which is actually one of the main motivations for why the database was created in the first place. So in religious studies and history, there is a lot of instances where you have generalizations where people say things like India, China, and Japan have all been able to develop fairly cohesive societies without help of monitoring big gods. Well, despite the focus on the particular, we make these kind of generalizations quite regularly, and the broader the generalization, the less likely the reference is to actually substantiate that generalization. And generally, really broad generalizations are not directly linked to facts, but the sense of the author about the field. And generally, the intuitions of scholars aren't up to the task, because academia has changed very quickly. So a couple of academic generations ago, everyone knew everyone else in their small subfield, and generalizations were grounded in personal knowledge. But publication patterns have really changed since then, and the number of publications have grown so dramatically that it's just not possible for any single academic to actually keep up with reading all the literature in the field these days. Because, yeah, a generation ago, research was published slowly in handbooks and textbooks, edited volumes, and there's far lower amounts than there are today. And you could depend on the gatekeepers of the field to actually have a good comprehensive knowledge of the field. But today, even very specialized fields are growing too largely for any one person to keep track of, and research is published across languages and across countries. So even if you can keep up with all the research in the languages you speak, it's unlikely that you'll be able to keep up with all the research that's actually going on across the world. So therefore, the main motivation for the creation of the database was to be able to actually test these generalizations. So, for example, looking at is supernatural monitoring present, I'm using a rough area, which is a larger amount of Asia than just India, China, and Japan. But across our database, it looks like supernatural monitoring is more frequently present. And that is why the main reason for the database being created in the first place is to be able to actually test out these generalizations. So far, the database is available in English, Chinese, Japanese, and French, but we're looking to expand to other languages soon, because we're currently developing a new poll translation tool. So the design of the DRH has been to allow for maximum flexibility, and as I've already mentioned, there's lots of layers of complexity, which poses quite big challenges from my perspective as a data scientist actually looking to use this data. So because there's not been so far a specific sample, how do you actually select a sample of religious groups from the overall database? How do you handle missing data, because there will be missing data? How do you handle disagreements between experts? And how do you handle the multiple levels of complexity which are embedded into the design of the database? So for sampling, so far we've mostly been looking at region, time period, and also doing quality control, such as, is the region and time period correct? Getting the editors in those specific areas just to double check, are there any mistakes? But yeah, on the so we know that our database is going to have missing data. Most modern real world data sets have missing data. We have a historical data set where we know that records have not been completely observed. We know that records are lost over time. So therefore, we would not expect to ever be able to have a complete data set. So we need to account for the fact that there'll always be known unknowns. So that's part of the reason why the answers are designed to have the yes, no, field doesn't know, I don't know, because field doesn't know is more informative than I don't know or unanswered, because field doesn't know tells us we have a known unknown. So potentially that is an area where we will never know the answer. So we need to consider that for future analysis. But if an entry has multiple answers, we try and use statistical methods which allow for us to actually encode that uncertainty between yes and no. Yeah, so I just want to say that the database is not yet properly open access. It's all publicly available, but you can't directly download the data from the database because we've had technical issues. But if anyone would like the data, please email me. I'm happy to share it. We have snapshots for every time I publish a paper, the data's available for it. We're working on getting an API later this year, so it will properly open access at that point, but Until that's available, please email me and we will share the data with you. It's just a technical problems right now where it's not, until we've got the API, it's difficult to send data over directly. So I just wanted to finish with a couple of my thoughts about database design. So things I would change about the DRH if it was started from scratch. So I would add entry versioning from the start. I would use persistent identifiers rather than just numeric IDs as is being used, and I would allow for uncertainty in coding of time periods and regions, because right now it's not possible to do that. And I would add so if you're thinking about designing your database, I would think about how are you going to gather your data? Are you going to use an expert-led approach, or are you going to use an RA-led approach, because that will affect a lot how the database should be designed. And I'd think about how easy will it be to implement future changes if you realize that there are design elements where you need improvement. So for example, the DRH features we've added over time would be things like the bibliography and media. So media was not too difficult to add, but the bibliography has been more of a problem. So that would have been better to have early on, but it's important to consider that flexibility. I would always think about how will the platform be sustained if funding runs out. So we, again, do not have permanent funding. It's all individual grant based. So we have a deal with UBC. If we run out of funding, they will run a archived version of the database where there'll be no new development, but they'll keep the website online. And also think about how should that database individual component data sets, facts be cited, because there may be instances where people want to cite a specific entry or data set within a whole database. So I would just like to thank my collaborators in the database, the editors and experts, and yeah, please let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. This was very educational, and we have a good 20-25 minutes for questions. So that should give us ample time to ask all sorts of questions. Charles, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. This is really cool stuff. There's a lot of things that I could ask, but I want to start with a kind of hyper-technical one, just because I noticed this in one of your screenshots and I thought it was really cool. I noticed in the screenshot of your search page that you keep old versions of some of your data sets alive and let people search against them. Talk to me about the choice about making that, and like, do people actually use that button?
Yeah. Yes, people do use that, and I certainly use that. So it's really useful for internally within the team, and the intention is that down the line you will be able to do that search, download the data if you want, but also share it with your collaborators. And if you're interested in that data set, you can then check it like a year down the line, see how it's changed. That's the intention of having that, and that was intentional design earlier on in the database.
That's brilliant. I really like that. Yeah, thanks so much. I've got to chew on that now. That's a really cool idea.
And just to add on to that, we have a similar design in the encyclopedia that is sort of our pet encyclopedia for the belief system of our little team. You can also go through the versions of what the team believed, which is a good thing. This is not only giving you data on what historians think about that, about the particular periods in history, but also what that team thought, or what the view of the team was. So then later on, if a historian of a database of religious history, let's say 20 years from now, they start studying that, you already have that data documented. So that's a very good thing to also document the belief, the history, changes in
Yeah.
the belief system of your own community. It's also a good thing.
I should have mentioned, but didn't, is that we have versioning of individual question answers as well. So if an expert changes the answer over time, we have versioning of that, and you can click and see how they've changed their opinion. I mean, they may not have changed their answer, they may have just added a source or expanded their notes, but they can also change their answer over time if their knowledge is updated.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you very much. Stefan.
Thank you. I have a question about your independent variables, your religious groups, and a question about your dependent variables. So I'm just curious how, it seems that religions could be carved up at a very coarse grain or a very fine grain, right? You have sects within sects within sects, and some religions are kind of famous for this. That seems to be an issue, and I'm just wondering if you have something to say about that. And my other question had to do with a lot of the variables you presented were dichotomous, either present or not present. And I was thinking, for certain types of analysis, you might want to say how present. So those structures you were talking about, is one structure enough? Do they do it a lot? And was that just too tough to incorporate, or is it there, or is it possible to add it?
Yeah, so I'll do your second question first. Yes, generally for stuff like structures, there are questions about how many structures and size of structures. I just didn't include that in this. Those are some of the numeric answer questions we have. And as the first question, for our tagging system, we have an entirely expert-led approach, so they get to choose what grain of religion of the religion they want to include about their entry. So we would try and discourage an entry that will say on the entirety of Christianity, but we are generally pretty permissive as to the grain that an expert wants to include. We try and be led by them as opposed to enforcing it. So that does mean that our tagging system is evolving over time, and it does mean that there may be disagreement between experts in terms of how entries should be tagged, but we allow each expert to choose how they want to tag their entry.
Thank you very much. Nicola.
Thank you for this presentation. Actually, I have a very general question. Are there any challenges in managing database that you think are specific to the subject matter, i.e. religious history? And conversely, are there any good ideas from your previous experience with the managing database that you were able to implement?
Yeah, so I have so things I wanted when we joined was versioning of data of entries, which we are going to have implemented very soon. So that would be something from previous data sets that I considered. And in terms of where the DOH is specific versus general, I'd say quite a lot of our challenges are specifically related to the fact that we've got historical data. I think challenges around the religious data are less field specific, more due to the fact that we're using this poll system. So the polls are updated over time. So if we realize that there are areas of questions that we're missing, we will add new versions of polls, and we're going to allow soon for a new system where experts can update current entries to new versions of the polls so they can answer new questions as we add them to the database, because there have been areas where we didn't consider initially. But I think the biggest problem that we have as in general is the fact that it's historical data, so the missing data is a bigger problem than it would be for some newer data sets, and the fact that we always will have these known unknowns. which we will never be able to get data for because it just doesn't exist. So going far back in history, we'll never know what the religious practices were because the data has been lost over time.
Thank you very much. Paul?
I was one presupposition of the whole project is that religion constitutes a natural kind. That I'm wondering whether you can justify that, whether, say, monotheistic religions might be so fundamentally different than religions that posit a plethora of polytheistic gods, or something like Buddhism that doesn't posit a god. And that's, in some cases, take Hinduism. Hinduism was the category of Hinduism was created by Westerners that imposed it on the whole variety of religions on the Indian subcontinent. So I'm wondering, is there a risk of taking something and forcing it into a mold?
Yes, I'm just going to actually share now some of the slides that I skipped because I thought with my internet going that I was going to completely run out of time. Because we actually have a paper which was accepted in JAR last year, but actually still isn't published. I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but should be out. It was accepted in June last year, so I'm hoping it will be available soon. So this was an analysis where we actually looked at whether the category of religion actually matched at all with how experts were answering the questions about each religion. So did the imposed categories match with the how the experts were actually answering questions about the religion? So were those features of the religion, did they actually represent true categories? And we used Bayesian phylogenetics to look at this. What we found is there does seem to be there is correlation between the imposed categories and the how the questions are actually answered, which does lend some support to the fact that religion as a concept is a useful concept. And how I think about it is like the concept of a species. So we know that there is no true single definition of a species, but it's still a useful classification system. So I think that's what our analysis indicates, the category of religion is a useful classification system, even if there are limitations to it.
And on that same note, I agree with Rachel. I think even if it turns out that there is no such thing as a religion as a natural kind in any way, or a social kind in this case, still you can take a step back and say, well, we're doing a database of belief systems that can roughly be characterized as dealing with religious beliefs and practices in a most inclusive way, in the same way in which historians of science treat the notion of science, right, as pretty much any knowledge production enterprise. Like in the last 20 years at least, that has been the way in which they do history of science, and that allows them to include things like medieval science and non-European science and so on and so forth. So the more inclusivity, the better. I don't think it's a big problem here. In fact, it's great.
But you're right, there is a lot of discussion within the field about that. So that was why one of our first analysis pieces was about this. But yeah, I wish I could say I knew when it'll be available, but yeah, I wish we'd posted a preprint because it's been accepted for a year or nearly a year and it's still not actually published yet.
I have a few questions, but I will be happy. Please, the participants, feel free to stop me at any time if you have other questions, because I can go on forever here, and I suspect Rachel might need to schedule a meeting or even several meetings if
Yes,
you're
sure.
amenable to it. I'll just ask a few things. So one difference that we potentially see between the database of religious history and the database of intellectual history as we envisage it is going to be very likely the fact that while religious belief systems can be taken as relatively stable, and even if they change, there's a seemingly an easy way of handling it. Just create a new entry.
Yeah.
Let's say, I don't know, Catholic Christianity after 19th century. I'm just guessing. I'm not a historian of religious, but I'm assuming that's how it's chopped up, right?
Yeah.
Because you include in the temporal aspect within the entry itself.
Yeah. And within the entry, experts can also answer differently for different time periods if they want to. So they can say yes for this time period, no for this subsequent time period if they choose to.
Yeah, so that seems to be working very nicely in the context of religious beliefs. It doesn't seem to be particularly applicable to changes in general belief systems. For instance, if we were to take, I don't know, Newtonian mechanics, or even something smaller than that, it seems that changes in individual answers to individual questions happen all the time. It's an ongoing process. So we would not be able to chop it up. And if we were to do that, it'd probably be with an annual precision. I don't know, Newtonianism in 1711 being different from Newtonianism in 1712. So that may not work that well. So we'll have to probably bring it back to individual. So as a database designer and as a person who's been dealing with this, would you have any recommendation for us on that? How would you handle that?
I would definitely allow for levels of certainty, because I would have codings as to something like very certain to not certain, and also potentially looking at how confident you are that this is how widely generalizable is this, and I'm not entirely sure how I'd encode that, but I'd make sure that those encodings are available. And I'm assuming this is ones where you definitely know the time period where it's yes, this is what was thought, but then you don't know how far broadly around that it spread. So I'd try and find a way to allow for fuzzy date ranges surrounding it. So you have a strong certainty of date range or a single date where you know this was the case, but allow for fuzziness around the date ranges where it may have been the case.
Thank you very much. And just to clarify, so this is very useful. I was actually going to be my next question. How do you guys incorporate incompleteness? But that's the next question. For now, I just wanted to know, there are situations when historians have a clear idea that, let's say, before a certain point, something was accepted, and after that, it wasn't, or the other way around. I mean, for instance, in the recent history, we can make a very good case that the general physics community accepted the existence of Higgs boson around 2013. Like, you can make a case almost that precise. It's not always like that. Very often there's a range. For instance, the acceptance of Newtonian idea of gravity would in France probably would be around 1740s, give or take. So how to incorporate that within the same agent, so same belief system. I'm having a hard time seeing how the approach of the database of religious history could be implemented. So would you say we would need a new solution there?
I think you probably would need a new solution where you have some kind of persistent agent, but you allow for multiple, I can't remember what your levels of facts were, but you allow for multiple facts that will change over time, and you allow for fuzziness potentially as to those time range overlaps. And that's how I would think about it. But I think, yeah, you're right, you would need a different system for it, because the level of knowledge you're interested in is different from thinking about a religious group, because yeah, it's a different, you'll need a different structure compared to the DRH, I would agree.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a key difference there. A religious group might be defined, and probably is defined, by whatever belief system they subscribe to. The scientific community, epistemic communities in general, are not defined by that.
Yeah.
They are defined by their social organization, social structure, the fact that they have a collective intentionality of studying the world together and have forming collective views on that. And those views themselves change drastically.
And you can have
yeah.
And you can have very different views within the field as well. So yeah, I agree that you definitely need a different approach, because there is a lot more fuzziness than there is generally for what one specific religious group will believe. If you although if you say looked at Christianity as a whole, there'll be lots of fuzziness as to what the beliefs are across different sects, but that's why we try and mostly focus on smaller levels where there is less fuzziness.
Yeah, it seems that an agent-based approach, so identifying epistemic agents and then tracing their stances towards questions and theories, seems to be the way to go forward. Yeah. Thank you very much. I don't want to monopolize this time because, as I said, I have hundreds of questions that I could potentially ask, but we'll probably have to postpone them for a separate meeting. If anyone else has any questions, please, you can type in a chat window or yes, Stefan.
Thank you. I'm wondering, at the early stages of the development of this, what were you thinking about, the existing databases that were out there, like the Human Relations Area File and the cross-cultural sample? Was there a discussion about whether to incorporate some of those findings as a kind of backbone or something like that? Or did you just say we're going to forget about them and start fresh?
So this happened prior to my joining, but we do have some of the, so we actually are over time trying to transfer all the cross-cultural sample data into the DRH, just and there's an RA over there who's doing that, but it's a time-consuming process. So and obviously a lot of our questions don't necessarily map well onto the questions in HRAF, so we only can transfer limited information because the questions don't necessarily map well onto the variables. So I don't know whether that was a consideration in the design or it was soon afterwards, but we certainly, since we started having public entries, there has been inclusion of those.
See, what I like about what you've done is that it's independent. And so if I'm testing a hypothesis about the evolution of religion, say, I've got two different data sets I can go to, and I can test it in two independent ways, as long as you don't incorporate too much of that other stuff directly. There would be a case there for a kind of robustness to one's hypothesis testing.
Thank you very much, Paul.
My question was, so there's one difference in the way we study science and the way that you study religion, and that's that you define a religious community in terms of its belief system. But what about belief change? What about religious conversion? What about when, are there any similarities between those things in the process of scientific theory change?
I think we're certainly seeing that in terms of data we're looking to gather now, where we're looking to try and get data on new emerging religions as opposed to historical ones, where obviously the way we're having to do the database, we can't do it until there has been a new religion emerged, and that's our challenge, is that we can't necessarily yet well track, is it a separate religion or is it going to be the same as an existing one? So, but we've applied for a grant where we aim to look into this, so it's going to depend on whether we get that grant or not.
How do you define what's a new religion? Would QAnon, for example, qualify as a new religion?
QAnon would qualify as a new religion.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your wonderful questions, and Rachel for your wonderful answers. Thank you very much again, Rachel.